So, welcome to the Writer Center's virtual craft chat series, where we talk with writers a little less about what they wrote and a little more about how they wrote it. My name is Zach Powers. I'm the artistic director of the Writer Center, and I'm also a fiction writer. I've published a story collection and a novel, and that is why I get the privilege of discussing this book we're talking about today with our wonderful guest, Kim Fu, and her book, Lesser Known Monsters of the 21st Century. 21st, I put it the 24th century there for a second. I did Star Trek on this, but 21st century, which is one of my favorite story collections in a long, long time. I really, really thoroughly enjoyed it. I was anticipating enjoying it, and I'm so glad that it exceeded my expectations. So, Kim, I want to welcome you. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much, Zach. I'm so happy to be here.
So, do you have a copy of your book handy?
I do, yeah.
Would you mind reading us just a brief excerpt so that people here have a taste of what your writing is like and what we'll be talking about for the next hour or so?
Sure. And yeah, so thanks again to you and the Writer Center and to everyone for logging in listening. I'm going to read the very beginning of a story called 20 Hours. After I killed my wife, I had 20 hours before her new body finished printing downstairs. I thought about how to spend the time. I could clean the house as a show of contrition, and when she returned to find me sitting at the shining kitchen island, knickknacks in place on dusted shelves, a pot of soup on the stove, we might not even need to discuss it. I could buy flowers. I could watch the printing, which still fascinated me, the weaving and webbing of each layer of tissue, the cross-sectional view of her internal workings like the ring sections of a tree trunk. I had poisoned her, a great wallop of poison in her morning coffee. So I didn't have the defense of passion, a momentary loss of reason. Poison took forethought. Poison said, I wanted to be apart from you for a while. Then why not just leave the house? Why not go for a walk? No, it said more than that. Poison said, I wanted you to not exist for a while. I wanted to move through the world without you in it. There'd been no choking, gasping, flailing, spewing. Connie simply keeled over at the table. The soft thunk of her weighty head, the clatter of her empty cup tipping off the saucer, spilling its dregs. Painless, I hoped, though I would have to take her word for it later, either way. I wrapped her briskly in a sheet, put her out on the porch, and filled out the online form for same-day pickup. And I'll leave it there.
Thank you so much. I realize I didn't have any questions about humor, so I'm asking someone. I'm requesting that someone in the audience have a good question about the use of humor, because you have, I think, a great use of humor in fiction as well. But in your own words, just introduce yourself to everyone. Who are you?
That's such a terrifying existential question. Yeah, I'm Kim Fu. I'm a writer. I'm the author of 2 novels and a collection of poetry, and then most recently this short story collection. I'm from Canada originally, but I've lived in Seattle, Washington for the last 10 years. I like to think of myself as a great lover of art in kind of the broadest sense of the word. You know, I love live theater and dance and visual art and movies, and video games, which I consider art, which is a whole, I guess, topic of conversation. Yeah, I mean, I've wondered how people in general answer that question. Like if you send people off on, if people stare off into space for 2 minutes, because I can imagine that too.
I think that would be a form of answer, though. That's who you are as a person who, in the face of the dreadful existential question to begin. But I was actually helpful, because I feel like the broadness of your artistic interests actually makes me rethink your work, and not rethink, but reconsider the sources of your inspiration in your work, that I see some of that coming through now that it's been mentioned. So I found that helpful. So I thought it was a great answer. So this is what I think is the hardest question, and what we call the first question, which is, what question do you really wish someone would ask you about your writing or writing practice? What haven't you gotten to speak about before, or at least maybe not much?
Yeah, you have all kinds of tough questions. I think something that does get a little lost sometimes when I'm having conversations about craft is how much my process has varied and changed over the years, and has been different for every book, but then also like every piece of writing even. I think it'd be really interesting to know, like to look back at my answers to the same questions if you caught me at like different moments in time and like when I was working on different books. Just like as an example, I think when I was writing my my novels, I was working on a lot of other things at the same time. I was writing a lot of nonfiction and poetry and sort of bouncing around. And I think if you'd asked me then, I would have said, oh, that's a super important part of my process. I need to be able to jump between things when something's not working. But then when I was writing this collection, I was like laser focused on one thing at a time. Like I was only writing these stories, and usually I was only writing one of these stories, and I was, really deep in it, really focused on it, not writing anything else. Some days not like thinking about anything else or being aware of anything else. And I think now I would say, oh, that's a super important part of my process. So like, I'm really excited to talk about how this book came together, but it's also like, and not to say that there aren't like through lines or things I have learned, but it is interesting to me how much those answers are, forever in flux as your career proceeds.
That's really fascinating. I think like it's not a static thing when you learn craft. It's a thing you're constantly learning more about, and probably to the distress of my agent, I am not necessarily inclined to stay on a straight and steady path. It's also there's pressure. There's pressure to keep doing the same thing because they want you to build your brand, quote unquote. So yeah, I think it's good to note that you don't have to do that. So one thing I wanted to talk about very broadly is I was interested in the story collection when I read the description because it seemed to fit into what Karen Russell said, the author Karen Russell once called lovingly team weird, which is authors who are willing to grab a weird premise, a weird idea, something unreal, something fantastical, and run with it in stories. And that is, I think, the case in most of the works in the collection, if not almost all the works. I think there may be one I think is not quite as obviously that, but in context, I think it is. I've digressed way too much there. Anyway, what draws you to fantastical or speculative premises in your short fiction?
I think one thing is similar to what draws me to poetry, in that I think in a way it's like easier to articulate feelings, especially like really nebulous feelings or really nebulous ideas or like emotional experiences, I guess. If you can reach for metaphor to that extreme, sort of like I think there's a way in which, grief is not necessarily best expressed by describing a funeral. Like it might be by describing a monster, like that is the best way actually to zero in on how that grief feels or how I'm thinking about it. Or like my feelings around, social media or, particular technologies or platforms. It might be harder for me to articulate them if I were to say like write an essay about that technology. But if I like made up a fictional machine and was like writing about that, I feel like paradoxically somehow it like gets me closer to how I actually think and feel about those things. And then I think the other half of it is just because you can sort of, I feel like in real life, in the real world, you're trapped with what is, and with what is physically possible and your one little life. And one of the great things about being a writer is, I guess, that you get to go beyond, right? You get to imagine and create whatever you want. And so why not go beyond what is literally possible, right?
I remember in a review of my story collection, I don't remember the reviewer at this point, but they pointed out that I think it might be the last story in the collection is this big metaphor for social media and living in social media. And I swear I had never once thought that when I was writing it. But once he said, it was like, oh yeah, that must have been somewhere in my brain. I must have been processing that nature of public self. Anyway, yeah, so it is interesting the way that even if you're not thinking about it, those things come out when you work in that sort of metaphorical realm. Is this the kind of short fiction you prefer to read most, or are there influences in this kind of short fiction that you think were formative or that you still look to today?
Yeah, I mean, like I also love Karen Russell. I keep a spreadsheet of all the books I read, or like I have since like 2010. And I was curious recently, and I started writing this book towards the very end of 2017. And I was curious, like, what was the last thing I read before I started this? And it was Stories of Your Life and Others by Ted Chiang. So it's like, I was probably reading that book and I was like, okay, I have to do this. I think Elizabeth McCracken is like a less obvious influence, but I see it 100%, where something I really admire is a lot of her stories and her novels. They're technically realist. Like technically everything in it is possible, but it has that sense of reality and humor and strangeness and focus. Like the focus that having like a point of unreality brings to the story, like the kind of intensity and, like surrealness is there. I love Kevin Brockmeyer, and he actually was the first blurb that came back, and I don't know him at all. Like I don't know anyone who knows him. And so that felt incredible. Like it just, that it made it to his desk at all, and that he that read it and that he liked it meant so much to me, because I think his prose is so gorgeous, and his ideas are so out there and fascinating. Matt Bell comes to mind too as another like weird writer I love. But yeah, definitely. This is definitely I'm team weird.
Good. So, and Matt Bell will be here for Craft Chat in a couple weeks. So
perfect.
Thank you for the plug. So I haven't read your novels yet, because this is how I discovered you. I'm going to get your novels and read them now, because you are on my Instabuy list for the rest of your career. So thank you for joining that list. But the novels, at least reading the premises, maybe are a little more straightforward sounding than not quite as much of a speculative premise for those as I found in the short stories. Is that correct? Is that a correct assumption on my part based on limited knowledge? Because it was interesting to me, because I know when I'm writing, the longer I write, the less I am able to sustain the weird or the fantastical premise. That there's sort of like this concentrate, like I can sustain the experiment of that for a shorter amount of time. Is that something you've experienced? Do you sort of feel that short stories lend themselves to the more fantastical style, while the longer you go, you have to maybe fall back into more of a standard storytelling format? Or is that just me?
I think I have experienced that less as qualities inherent to the forms, and more kind of just like in my development as a writer, and then also kind of the lies you have to tell yourself to get going at all. I think earlier on, when I was writing my novels, I would have speculative ideas that would fall apart because I would overwork them a little bit. Like I would be convinced I had to understand them. I'd understand the mechanics on like a really extreme level. I had to know absolutely everything about this world and all of its history and how everything would work. And if I thought of a, imagined machine or a scenario, I had to know all of its like global repercussions of every kind. And eventually I would hit upon like, this is impossible for whatever reason. Or I would just, I would grind it to dust until it like no longer interested me anymore, when that isn't even the story I want to tell in the first place, right? Like usually it's like I want to tell this small human story that's this one slice that just takes place in this world. But I would just get so lost in the weeds of this type of world building that I wouldn't be able to do it. I also feel like I used to have a unrealistic standard of originality for speculative fiction that I don't have for realist fiction. Like just as an example, like if you had thought, I'm going to write a story about a woman caring for her dying father, right? You wouldn't think, oh, but there's so many stories out there about a woman caring for her dying father, right? You would just like, that's not a criteria that we have for literary fiction, or that I don't usually. Like it's like, how is the story told? Is it compelling? Is it interesting? Like you'd evaluate it on its merits that way. But if I have a story about, an imagined machine, I would worry that's like, oh, that's been done. There's been so many science fiction stories about a machine like that already. Like I felt like it had to be new. And so these were like the two issues, is I felt like it had to be new to a kind of an extreme degree that I don't hold realist fiction to that standard. And then two, I felt like it had to be like, it had to make perfect sense. Like I almost had to the degree like where I would have to be inventing that machine literally, like it would have to actually be possible, and I have to fully understand the science of it, which, I don't have the capability to do. So I feel like I had all these roadblocks that prevented me from writing speculative fiction for a long time.
Yeah, I remember on that front, I have a story in my collection about a person married to an inanimate object. And then later I read Amelia Gray had a story, and I had met her and I said, sorry, I did that. She said, don't worry, we all have a person married to an inanimate object story out there. So that's its own genre, I guess, at this point. So I think that's I really like that point. I've never considered that way before too. You may have freed my mind a little bit next time on my weird stories, trying not to be too weird. There was a question in the chat I want to turn to, which is, how do you hope readers will reflect on this collection in the future beyond the 21st century?
I mean, I think every writer hopes that their writing has a certain timeless quality, that, I I don't know how this sounds, but I remember like being an undergrad and reading Tennyson, for example, right? And he would be writing a poem about his religious crisis after his close friend had died, right? And I was reading this poem as like an 18-year-old whose like boyfriend had just dumped her, right? And it felt like it was about that, like that, which is crazy, right? It's like these experiences could be more different. We could not be demographically more different. This is across hundreds of years. And nevertheless, it like felt like it spoke to my feelings in that way. And I think every writer hopes that they do that to some degree. I do think that I do also think it sort of reflects anxieties uniquely of the moment a little bit too. And that it could provide insight in that way to sort of that anxious feel in the moment, maybe especially in conversation with other books. Like maybe if in the future they're looking at all the things that were written during these years, that you would speak to a body of work that way.
I like the idea of balance between timelessness and immediacy. Like I feel like they're not saying it's my favorite book, but I feel like, Gatsby is timeless more or less, and it's still taught partly because it illuminates the moment that it was written. And so you can't separate its timelessness from its immediacy from when it was written. And I think that's interesting. And I apologize for using Gatsby as a reference. I vow never to do it again. But that was the one that caught to mind.
Tennyson, like we're
that seems classier still than mine, but I'll go with it. Yeah, that's great. There was one more question. This is a fun question. Since you have a spreadsheet, you'll probably know, how many books do you read in a year?
So what's really interesting about that is I feel like I can chart how my life was going based on how that number fluctuates. I can tell like it was a good year, like I feel like I can tell like it was a good year because I read, over 50 books. And then, a year where the year after my father died, I read like 12, like that's like something I can see, that I can look back and see, but I can also, and I can see how the books I've read relate to what was going on in my life. But I've noticed it has dropped a lot during the pandemic, actually, and that I'm reading so much slower now. I think I haven't really unpacked why that is exactly, but I feel like the kind of book I used to read in a weekend now takes me like a few weeks. I think something about this time has been a little bit brain melting, and I'm still grappling with that. And I hope everyone is being gentle to themselves if they are too.
Well, while we're on that topic, how is your writing faring during that? Are you feeling like you're producing work okay, or are you feeling the same sort of 2 years in slog that I think many of us are feeling?
I'm still feeling the slog. Something that was really important for this book in particular was that I wrote a lot of it around other people. I especially started stories around other people, like getting together with writer friends. We would meet up and we would chat for 15 minutes and then we would write for an hour, say, or even I also used like meetup groups, or like there was like a group at the library that like met in the library basement to just, you just sit in a room and write together. And that was really important, especially again, starting stories, or like when I was feeling burnt out or blocked, like just being around other people who were taking their work really seriously. And yeah, I don't know. I feel like it's really easy for writing to feel less important than all your other commitments and work and gigs. And that was so helpful to me writing this book, and so important to this book, that when I had to like go from that to, total lockdown at the beginning, and then for several phases since, that was really hard. It was really hard to lose that. And I also feel like that was like hard to build, it was hard to find and build that community. And so I felt that as a huge loss. And I do feel like that really affected my writing and the way I write. And now, as I'm looking at as I'm, starting out on my next book, I'm trying to figure out what that's going to look like, and having to, try to rebuild all of that again.
Yeah. Thank you. So back to the spreadsheet for a minute from the chat. Why did you start that spreadsheet? I love the spreadsheet is catching fire here. Why did you start the spreadsheet, and does it inform your writing?
I started the spreadsheet because I would genuinely forget whether I had read books or not. I would come across books in the wild and be like, this is great. And then I would be like 30 pages in and be like, wait a minute, I think I've read this before. Yeah, and I think it's an interesting diary of sorts, right? I think it lets me look back on my influences and and what I was reading and what I was thinking about and how my interests have shifted. Does it inform my writing? I think not consciously. Like I think my reading is really eclectic and sort of all over the place. Especially now, I feel like there were phases when I was working on specific projects where my writing was more focused, and I would sort of choose books for specific reasons related to what I was working on. But especially right now, I feel like my tastes are all over the place, and I think like that's interesting, like retrospectively, to see like I'm not consciously saying like I'm going to choose these books so much anymore because this is like to guide me to my project. It's more just now it's like interesting to look back and see, oh, those books resulted in this piece of writing.
Yeah, great. So we have a publication question in the chat. So how did this book get published? Do you have an agent, or do you approach publishers yourself? And I might add too, since this isn't your first published book, how did this publication process maybe compare to previous publication experiences?
I do have an agent. She's been my agent from the beginning. She sold all three of my fiction books. My poetry book, I did approach publishers directly because she doesn't handle poetry. How did it differ? Well, this was my first time working with Tin House, and they're so wonderful. I could not speak more highly of them. Which is not to say that my other publishers weren't great, but I feel like Tin House is like on another level. They are the happiest people in publishing I've ever met. They all seem to genuinely love their jobs, and they seem to really like each other. They are incredibly attentive and excited, and they're really incredible. I would recommend them without reservation to any writer. Yeah,
I'm a product of the Tin House writing workshops, so I've also in my early formative years. So I'm definitely been a fan of them and their publishing house since they've started that as well.
Every writer that has worked with them speaks about them in glowing terms. Like even in like private gossipy circles where people are like complaining about things, everybody loves Tin House.
Now we need to dig up some dirt in Tin House. They leveled the playing field with them a little bit. They're doing too well. How did you choose the specific stories for this collection? Were there stories written that you did not consider or removed from this collection?
So these stories were all written like with the intention of being a collection together. Like they were all written from this set period of time from like 2017 to 2020. I didn't like go back through my earlier stories and look for ones I still liked and wanted to like collate together. There was one story that was in the original manuscript that got cut in the end. It was written in the second person, so like in a you form, and it was extremely ambiguous. And basically it was just like everyone just felt like it didn't fit, like that it didn't, no matter where you put it in the manuscript, it didn't seem to flow with the story before and after. And it also, like that story I had written actually for a commission that had really specific constraints. It was for a summer fiction project for actually the magazine that is in the seatbacks on Air Canada. They did a summer fiction feature, but it had all these really specific requirements. And so I wrote a piece for those really specific requirements. And then, yeah, basically my agent's assistant, my editor, like everybody thought it's like, this one just doesn't fit. So we nixed that one. And then the story actually I just read from 20 Hours was actually like the last story written. It was written kind of late in the process when the book was already with Tin House. And so that one got added. Like that one was written like just a slightly after, the rest of them had been set.
Yeah, I mean, I had some questions about collecting stories. I might ask a couple more on that. Is how do you consider the arrangement on the page? And I asked that because whenever I'm asked, it's a question you get kind of a lot when you publish a story collection, is how do you consider arrangement? And my answer was, I just sort of moved them around till it felt right. I had no major thoughts about it. So I didn't realize I was supposed to think that much about it. Maybe that freed me from the worry that I think people have. But how did you choose the order? Was it you alone, or did the order change in the editorial process or with your agent?
So there were a few stories that I thought of as being like, oh, this is an early story, this is a late story, this is the ending. The final story in the collection, Do You Remember Candy? That was always in my head, the final story, and like the last image in that story was always for me the end of the book. And so I had like a vague sense like that. I did have a vague sense of progression. But actually, my editor at Tin House, Maisie, ended up revamping it quite a bit. And like most, especially, I feel like it was her idea to put the story that is the first story, pre-simulation consultation, as the first story. And that was an amazing phone call, kind of like hearing her explain like why she thought stories should be in a particular order, when she thought stories that were similar should be together, and when she thought they should be separated, kind of thematic resonances she saw. She felt like my original order was kind of like hiding the gems a little bit in a way. Like I feel like she found she had like a totally different perspective on showcasing them in a totally different way. And I loved it. Like we more or less just went with her order.
Mhm.
And I think that was incredibly helpful. Like having someone see them from the outside when you've been just, swimming them for so long is an incredibly valuable thing.
Or was there much editing of individual stories with Tin House? Or because I mean, usually with stories, many of them have been published individually in journals or magazines before you ever get to story collection. How much did those finished published stories change once they got to book form, either with Tin House or even before you started submitting the collection?
Well, as an example, In This Fantasy had been published before in the Hingston and Olson fiction calendar, short fiction calendar, and that story ended up changing a lot while it was with Tin House, and I think for the better, like quite substantially. Like I would say, like the overall, like it changed structurally, I guess. I mean, like it changed sort of in its bones to me. So I feel like that was not the fact that they had been published before in one form or another, like was not something that like either I or my editor was very concerned about. Yeah, I think a lot of the stories, their endings got tweaked a little bit. I think that was like where that like Maisie's feedback was really, really good. And it was also like in a different form that I had ever had before. I feel like mostly working editorially, we had mostly worked on the page. I think like we'd been really nitty gritty on the page. And I feel like, and it also had been sort of unidirectional in a way. It's like I had previously like gotten notes, and it's like I can choose to enact these notes or not. I feel like with Maisie, it was much more of like a two-way ongoing conversation where we talked about things at a higher level, and we talked, at a more abstract level sometimes, and more about how things felt, and then also like things that could be, like we actually talked about like, what if this happened instead, which I had never experienced with an editor before. And so they were these like really like invigorating conversations that where I would leave and I would like, okay, I want to write in that new bit that we talked about. So I like, and I think this is always something I struggle with, because like answering about how much revision did you do? Because sometimes I think, to me, like draft 8 and 9 are wholly different things, but then to somebody else, they'll be like, these are like exactly the same. I don't know what you're talking about. It's like, what have you changed? Like 2 commas. And to me, it's like, no, it's like completely different. Because I think that's how it feels in my head. Like, every comma is so sacred to me.
That's great. And I think very helpful. I mean, in my finished published novel, reading it out loud a lot made me like post-it note over lines from it, because I didn't like those lines anymore. So it's never done. And so if you go back to it with a critical eye, and especially with the help of a really good critical eye who's going to engage you, you're going to find things that change. So you're never done writing. I'm sorry. There's never a finished product. Back to the chat window. Do you analyze the books you read and like to understand why you liked it? And what do you look for?
Yes. I love talking about the books I've read with friends, and and especially with other writers, and kind of unpacking it that way. I think it is very like something actually I suggest to my students a lot, is like at the very beginning of when I'm working with someone one-on-one, I will say, what are your North Star books? Like, who are the writers that you want to write like, or you imagine someone who liked your work would like their work too, or the other way around, someone who liked them would like your work too. And then they give me those books and those writers. And then in reading those books, I can see more what they're going for. And then I can use those books to pull from examples. So if the student says to me, how do I write this kind of dialogue, or how do I introduce this kind of scene? It's like, I can turn to these books that, I know that they love and that are meaningful to them in this way, and try to find examples. Like, here's an example of this kind of conversation you're wondering about. So you can use them sort of directly in a technical way like that. But I also think there's value to like the non-analytical reading, in that you sort of remember why you're doing this in the first place, like that you get to all the things that those books give you, like that is what you're trying to do. That's what you're hoping to give to someone else.
Interesting for me. I feel like I'm more inclined to analyze when I'm not feeling like I'm enjoying something. Like I want to make sure that I'm not doing something wrong. And I'm trying to do it not even generously. I'm not trying to like point out why they're wrong. Like, am I being an ungenerous reader in this moment and not meeting the book where the book is happening? So it doesn't mean I'm going to like the book, but there have been times like, okay, I see what it's doing. Maybe not my thing, but I can appreciate what they were doing, and it's not their fault. It's me for being a human with tastes.
I think that's a really important skill to develop too, when you're like on this side of the industry. Like when I'm judging applications or a contest or an award or something, I feel like it's really important to be able to tease those things apart, to be analyzing why you like something or don't, and if there are more objective qualities, or if it's more about your personal tastes and the things that you relate to and like, that aren't like a fair way to be judging them for this context.
And there are things by writers I love that I don't like. So it's certainly not a condemnation of a particular author, even. It's just a piece not resonating at the right time. Mm-hmm. Back to the chat, are there spaces where you're finding community in new ways? I believe this was asked about when we were talking about the pandemic times and not having sort of going out and writing with writers kind of situations.
Yeah, another writer who's a friend of mine, Katrina Carrasco, she runs a Zoom writing group where that is structured similarly to the way that we used to do it in person, where everyone hops on the call for 15 minutes. We chat in general, but then also like about our intentions for the evening. And then we all go off and write. And then there's an email thread at the end of the night where people talk about what they have accomplished and what they were thinking about in terms of what they're working on. And that was really great. I really value having that. It's still not the same though. It's still not the same energy. And I still feel like my attention drifts in a different way, in a way that it wouldn't if we could just be all in the same room again. But I do think it's like, you have to do what you can.
Yeah. So next question in the chat from Rayleigh, I'm going to pass because that's usually the last question we ask. So I'm not forgetting you. I'm just going to pull it back up at the end of our chat. When you rewrite, do you write over a draft losing the original, or do you keep all drafts, all versions of all drafts?
It depends. I definitely would say I would definitely say there is usually a point when you're writing where you need to start in a fresh new document. Like you need to put away everything you've written so far, like all of the scraps, and try writing it again from the top and sort of see what comes out. Like for me, that it is usually a step that has to happen. And I think that's sort of painful. I think writers and like students really hate to hear that sort of. It's like, you need to try starting it again fresh. I think that's painful, right? To like let go of everything you've done so far. But yeah, you don't have to delete it, right? You can just put it in a drawer, put it to the side, and try writing from scratch again. I do think like later in the process, you're working more in the text. I probably don't keep, do as much version control as I should, kind of. It probably would be better to keep more versions than I do. Yeah, but I do think usually there's at least a point, at least once, where you need to start fresh.
Treat it like a plant, because once you pruned it, you can't go back. It's like there's no putting the leaf back on the tree. So so this is kind of a broad and interesting question, is do you have a writing philosophy or philosophies for writing craft that you admire, and how do you follow that advice?
I don't have like a one sentence mantra offhand I can think of.
How
Uh,
fun.
I can recommend a couple craft books off the top of my
Yes,
head.
please.
How to Write an Autobiographical Novel by Alexander Chee, I think is a really beautiful book. But then also that really I related to very strongly. Like I feel like it really spoke to my experience of writing and what I'm trying to do and how it feels. And it articulated a lot of feelings that I would not have been able to put into words, I think. And so that is like something I definitely recommend. And then I think for sort of the opposite reasons, I would recommend Craft in the Real World by Matthew Salesses, because that book was like a revelation. I feel like it sort of turned everything I thought I knew about writing on its head. And a lot of things that I thought of as being like objective things in writing were more, about like the historical context of those opinions, or I think it like that book sort of like turned everything I thought I knew on its head. And so I strongly recommend it for that reason. And that book is extremely practical as well. Like it's it is very much about craft. It's about in like the nitty gritty of it. And it's very technical. It gives you like clear guidance and examples and prompts and that kind of thing. Like it is in some ways a technical text and in some ways like kind of revolutionary philosophically.
Yeah, we had a copy of Craft in the Real World floating around the Writer Center for after it came out. It was just last year, wasn't it? What is time? But sometime recently. It's a fairly recent book. Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, how much do you self-edit, and at what point do you just hand it off to an editor?
I self-edit a lot. I subscribe to the go as far as you can by yourself before I would give it to like an editor that I have a professional relationship with like that with. I think earlier in my career, it was very helpful to me to have like reading groups, like to have groups of writers who we could share work with each other and to get their feedback as it was going. At this point, I more need moral support. Like I more have a couple of people I send things to where I need them to just be like, yes or no, kind of like, yes, this is great, keep going, or well, I guess, or to say like, I think this is too raw, like maybe put it away, as opposed to like actually having a direct editorial relationship anymore. I do think it's really important to hone your ability to edit yourself. And I think it's really hard to do that only on your own work. Like I think I learned to do that through editing other people's work, like both through, these groups of friends, but then also like working as an editor and a teacher. I feel like you practice this editorial eye on other people's work. And then I feel like it really helps you to be able to turn it back onto yours. Although I think you also need space and time to be able to do that. Like I think you can't do that in the first flush of writing something. I think you do need to put it away for a little while and come back to it. And then you'll be able to see it a little bit more objectively, a little bit more as a reader, right? Once you've had that space.
Yeah, I agree with that. That the drawer for a while is always such a helpful process. You think you're done, you're probably not if you haven't put it away for a bit. And also, I think you mentioned editing other people's work, and maybe the most useful advice I ever got was if you're in a workshop, give ridiculous amounts of feedback, marginalia, 2 pages of type notes, not because you care about the other person, maybe you do, but because that's actually a really greedy action. That's you claiming their work as a space to practice the skills you can then take back to your own work. And you're going to get way better at writing doing that than you will from listening to feedback other people give you. So I always thought that was a really helpful thing for the workshop setting.
I would agree with that.
This question in the chat is kind of interesting. How did you feel in the editing and publishing process of being done with this collection of speculative stories, as the title says, about the 21st century, when it seemed like so much of the century was happening in that time? Were there ideas coming up that could have fit in this collection? Are there any new stories do we have the sequel to this book and stories coming out from?
So right now I'm trying, I think I'm turning back to the novel. I think my next book is going to be a novel. It's been really interesting recently, like seeing authors who have books about pandemics coming out or that they've come out in the last couple of years, and then reading about them saying, I've been working on this for 15 years, like this was not meant to be timely. This is just sort of unfortunately prescient. And that's sort of how the book feels to me. I feel like less that this I and as I mentioned, I have actually not found the last 2 years inspiring, right? I found them to be very challenging creatively. Um, and and yeah, so I would say that's more how it's felt. It's felt more like unfortunately prescient than it has been like, oh, I wish like I could put more of like current events into this book.
Mhm. I think this seems like a tough question to me in the chat. Do you have a favorite story in this collection?
No, I mean that's a classic. Which is your favorite child? Kind of question. No, that's way too hard. Do you have a favorite story in your collection?
I don't know. I mean, there's definitely a hierarchy. If I had kids, I'd probably have favorites. Let's put it that way. I'd be a terrible parent. But yeah, I mean, there would be a hierarchy. I don't think I would have and they all came from different moods, different moments. So depending on my mood and the moment, I might have a different one because that relates better to that moment or mood than another one would. So that's my cop-out answer. I'm going to stick with it.
I would agree with that. Yeah, I feel like I might have a favorite one because that's the one closest to the mood I'm in at the moment.
Yeah. So do you have any writing practices to improve your writing? You did mention editing. Is there any other techniques or practices or tricks or tips that you employ in your writing process?
I do feel like consuming a lot of other art is important. Like I feel like that to me is part of the process. I think also sort of broadening your definition of what writing is a little bit. I think that there are phases of writing that it's easy to forget about, like to be really stuck in a very rigid definition of productivity. Like the only thing that counts as writing is sitting in this chair and generating words, where I do think there very often needs to be kind of a space to daydream a little bit, to be like imagining things in your own head, to go for a walk and interpolate from what you have, to just sort of give yourself space to think problems through, give yourself time to think problems through. I mean, like lots of writers cite walks. Walks are a good writing technique. This is a really small, specific thing, but I think trying to notice your own writerly tics is useful. Like if there are specific words you use a lot or specific actions that people take a lot. Like I remember at one point in something I was writing, I noticed people kept searching each other's faces. Like that phrase came up like multiple times. And I was like, that is like too specific of a phrase to be repeating. I in someone else's work, I said like people were constantly taking deep breaths. Certain constructions, like if you're using agrammatical constructions on purpose, like if you use the same one a lot, like omitting serial comma. So if you say like tooth and blood and bone, and instead of tooth, comma, blood, comma, and bone, like that can be really impactful, but not if it's in every paragraph. So yeah, I think I think that's something really specific that I think is useful. Is like looking for structures or words or small little actions that people are doing all the time in your writing, because I think that's hard to notice. And then once you do, kind of embarrassing.
I've gone so far as to make a spreadsheet once. Like I found a thing that would take your entire manuscript and plug out the words with word instances. Then you can control F them and find where they are and see how you're using them. So I don't recommend it. It was a terrible like month and a half of my life doing that process, but it's been done.
But yeah, just control effing an unusual word too.
Yeah.
To say like, have I used this unusual word a lot in this manuscript is a good question to ask.
Yeah. Back to the chat, you've written across a few genres. Did you find your process was different with each genre? How was writing short fiction from novel writing different for you, for example? And I'd throw in poetry too.
I feel like with the novels, there was a much longer period of time where I did not feel like I knew what I was doing. There was a lot more faith involved in a novel, I feel like, where I was writing a lot of, like for a very, very long time, I was writing pieces that did not seem necessarily connected, or I was experimenting to a very extreme degree. Like I was taking the set of characters and saying, oh, what if these characters are in an entirely different scenario, or like they know each other in an entirely different way, or they're different ages, or I do feel like I feel like the comparison I've often made is that I feel like writing a novel feels like you're trying to build a house while you're living on the build site. And so it's like you have to do all this work that is not exactly obvious why you're doing it, kind of, like you are pouring a foundation and you are framing a house while it's still not keeping out the wind, still not doing the functions of a house. Whereas I feel like for the short stories, for me, it was much more iterative. Like it was much more about like perfecting or polishing. Like I feel like from very early on, I would kind of have the structure and the main idea that the story turned on, and then it would be kind of just trying to drill down on it and drill down on it and drill down on it and like get it right, like try to make it as perfect as possible, which felt like a very different thing. Poetry to me feels a lot more intuitive and less workmanlike in a way, and a lot more mysterious to me in a way. Like I am less clear what I am doing at all. Sort of. It does feel like more of a gathering process, almost like moving through the world, sort of gathering things up and putting them together, as opposed to constructing things wholesale, I suppose.
There's an interesting comment in the chat here from we talked about pandemic writing before, but the story "Do You Remember Candy" felt so much like a pandemic story that it surprised me to learn that it was written pre-2020. So you may have been one of the authors who are tapping into the reading the future.
Yeah, I was actually really worried about that. Like I wrote that story in 2019, and then my book was already out on submission when the pandemic hit, and I was really worried that story would come across in a way I hadn't intended, that it would be kind of painful or even offensive in a way that I hadn't intended, because I had written it before this happened. I should say too, for like the people who haven't read it, it is a story where everyone in the world loses their sense of taste. And so that was like, yeah, that was a big concern of mine, actually, like in selling the book and then in going into revisions. And I felt worried about that until actually very recently, when I started to hear from readers who actually had lost their sense of taste. And they said they appreciated the story and that they felt like it took their pain and their experiences seriously. And, I can't say that's how everyone responded to the story, but hearing that from readers was like really wonderful and really meaningful to me.
Great. So I wanted to talk about just a sense of wonder as a writer. I feel like we talk a lot about the nuts and bolts of how you can get better at writing, but I'm really interested. There's a line near the end of the final story in the collection, and it is, to me, almost a thesis statement for the entire book, which was open and raw, flooded with wonder. And that's sort of, I mean, if I were describing if I blurbed your book, I would just copy and paste that and put the blurb there. Like that, you blurbed your own book. Through me, but I really, really love that line. I love the concept of it, I love it, but the idea of being open and flooded with wonder, how do you yourself as a writer let yourself be open to the big idea or a weird idea or the dangerous emotion or things that maybe this writing process we focus so much on might actually stifle? How do you keep yourself open?
Something I've been thinking about recently is the way I wrote when I was much, much younger. And then also, this is something also I think about whenever I have opportunity to read writing by teenagers or like by very young people. There's a sort of freedom and a certain energy to that writing when you don't think anyone's going to read it necessarily. When you are writing sort of into the void and primarily for yourself, you are writing to explore things for yourself and to like create little worlds and experiences for yourself. And I think there was a long period sort of in the middle of my career where I lost that. I would say like, especially around writing my second novel, where I got too much into my head about the world of publishing. I knew now what would happen. I knew what reviewers sounded like. I knew, I had my agent's voice in my head. I had, I imagined like everyone I ever never known reading it, right? I imagine like my cousins reading it and my, everyone I went to high school with reading it. And it was really paralyzing and it was really stressful. And it was very hard to break through. And I think only now am I trying to come back to that, to trying to come back to writing for myself in that way, like for that, because I do think that lets you write ideas that are more dangerous. It lets you, I feel like it lets you be open to bigger risks as a writer, things that you are afraid to write for whatever reason. If you're trying to get back to that, if you're trying to remember, why you did this in the first place back before anyone was waiting for it, theoretically, trying to write again, like with the the openness and the verb of teenagers again, I think is something I'm trying to do now.
I mean, I like that you mentioned that, because I also had jotted down another line that I liked it's from the story Liddy First to Fly. And the quote is, "The realm of pretend had only just closed its door to us, and light still leaked through around the edges." And I sort of like that idea of pretend having and play having a legitimate and great and wonderful place in writing. And certainly it was evident to me throughout. So I'm glad you mentioned looking back in that direction too, and finding inspiration and technique almost from youthful writing. We're almost out of time for a couple more questions. So I'm going to go to endings, since we're almost at the ending. And writing a story is one thing, landing it is another. And there's so many just outstanding endings in this collection. The ending of June Bugs will stick with me forever. I mean, that just completely worked for me in like a very memorable and lasting way. But when do you know where a story is going? Is this something you plan in advance? Do you write without a plan and end up at an ending at some point when you know you're there? Or do you discover the ending somewhere along the way?
I have a lot of thoughts about endings. The way I experience writing a story is I feel like it begins as like an infinite field of possibilities that sort of winnows itself down as you go. And I've noticed I tend to write characters who experience the world that way too. Like they're characters who like think they have lots of options, and then their options fall away until sort of one path becomes inevitable. And I do sort of feel like that's what points you in the direction of the ending. I do weigh possible endings in my mind a little bit. And I think one of the first questions I ask is like, what does the reader expect and want to happen? And in a very basic sense, like if there's a villain, like that they get their comeuppance, or if you're rooting for the character, that they get what they want. Like, what does the reader want to happen? And then how does the story feel if you give them what they want to happen, or if you don't give them what they want to happen? Like if you take it away the last second, or you subvert that expectation, or you go past and it's like not actually what the character wanted. And then I think the other thing that you ask yourself when you're looking at an ending is you go back to the beginning. Like if you put the beginning and the ending side by side, does it feel like they bookend something? Does it feel like you went on a journey from point A to point B, or does it feel like these things are totally unrelated and it's just like a lot of stuff happened? Yeah, and I also think like I work in images a lot of the time. I feel like I need images to begin, like something that I can, that I can see in my mind's eye really clearly, that I feel like I can experience with my senses. I need that to get started. And I think I need sort of a few of those as like signposts along the way to keep going. And then ultimately, like that is something I need to finish the story too, is I need to find that image that is the final image, like that's the last moment. And I've been thinking too that in the writers I like when I like to read, I like people who write in all kinds of different ways and storytelling traditions. Like I like writers who write in a chattier way, where like the voice of the character is what is carrying these things along. But for me, it is like scene and detail are like the thing I like to write. Like in my own writing, that's what's really important. And I think that's what helps me start a story. That's what helps me carry it through. And that's how I find the ending too.
That's great. And I liked your earlier point too about, considering what a reader might want most, and doesn't mean you have to give them that, but to consciously be aware of it and subvert it, give it to them. And sometimes a story giving the reader what they want is actually a good way for certain stories to end. And and certainly not doing that is a great way for other stories to end. So I'm thinking about stories in a new way already. So thank you for that. We are right here at the end of our time, so I do want to go to our final question. which was a variation of the question that was asked earlier in the chat. And our final question is, what's one piece of advice you'd give to a writer just starting out?
I would say find other writers. And find other writers who are starting out with you. I think that there's a lot of focus on or sometimes I feel like there's a lot of focus on finding like mentors or like networking, like trying to find people in power who can like lift you up. And that's, you know, that's valuable in its own way. But I think that in my experience, it is more important to have like a community that is coming up together, that you can support each other both emotionally and materially, you know, that you can read each other's work and go to each other's readings but also just like complain to each other, and like that's like other people who understand what it is you're doing. I think that kind of community will be important and vital, like your whole career.
Well, that's an answer I agree with wholeheartedly. And on that note, I just want to say thank you so much, Kim, for joining us. Everyone, please get a copy of Lesser Known Monsters of the 21st Century, one of my favorite story collections in a long time. Certainly my favorite one I've read so far this year, and I'm so excited to add it to my shelf and to have had this chance to talk to you. So Kim, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me and for your amazing questions, Zach.
And thanks everyone in the audience. We'll hopefully see you next time.